Good afternoon, brethren. Hope everybody had a good week this week. When I started high school, I was kind of short, I was very pudgy, and I was definitely out of shape. Now, I had a group of friends from middle school, but the high school that I went to merged with a much larger middle school, and most of my friends were not in my classes. So in the first few weeks of school, I was forced to make a whole new group of friends, which was difficult for me because I was very shy. Now, one guy that was in several of my classes was Juan, and I got along with him very well, and what I appreciated most about Juan was that he was a doer. He did not wait for life to come to him. He met it head first with as much speed as he could possibly muster, and sometimes he didn't have much forethought with things. But in ninth grade, that didn't seem to matter so much. So about the third week of school, Juan tells me that his high school cross-country team only has 5 guys, and they really needed me to sign up. Now, keep in mind, I'm pudgy, bordering on fat, terribly out of shape, and have no clue what cross-country even is. So I asked him what cross-country was, and he said they ran for a couple miles. For some reason, I just chalked that up to Juan exaggerating, because he had a tendency to do that. And in my mind, nobody ever ran more than a mile. So I assumed that that was probably what was involved. So that evening, I went home and I told my mom that I wanted to join the cross-country team the next day. Now, she didn't really say all that much to me. She smiled. But apparently she knew what cross-country was. I guess my dad had run cross-country. Now, either he didn't talk that much about it, which is possible, or I didn't pay much attention if he did, which is also possible. But I never knew that he ran cross-country. My mom told me later that she just smiled at me and thought, I wonder how this will go. But she said I could go, so the next day I showed up with my shorts and a t-shirt and some sneakers, and I went to cross-country practice. It was a Friday, and they did a short run that day. I didn't think it was a short run, but they thought it was a short run. The entire team basically ran in a leapfrog manner with the last person running to the front, and they ran through town, including, as I recall, through some department stores, which we got in trouble for later. But I enjoyed it, and I had the weekend to recover from it. Now, it didn't take me too long to figure out that Juan had not exaggerated, and that we really would be running races of 3.1 miles. But I liked the fact that I felt wanted on the team, and I hated the idea of quitting anything. So I stuck with it. I stuck with it all 4 years of high school. Now, I was never one of the good runners, ever. In fact, my greatest contribution to the team was that my brothers followed in my footsteps and joined the team, and they were good runners. But I learned some very valuable lessons from running cross-country, from running a race. And the Bible uses running as a metaphor for our Christian lives. Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're going to read verses 24 through 27. It says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus, I fight not as one who beats at the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." Paul here is stressing that we need to be focused on the prize, and that we need to drive ourselves with the concept of what's at the end. and we also need to be disciplining our bodies. I would note that I was not one of the best runners on the cross-country team. However, by the middle of the season, even that first season, people who were considered great athletes in my class, I could easily beat in a 3.1-mile race because they were not trained for it whatsoever. If you discipline your body, though, you can prepare for that. Let's turn back to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to read we'll start in verse 39. And this is at the end of the faith chapter. It says, all these, Hebrews 11:39, all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God. Again, it's the analogy of running. And what it's saying to us is all those examples of faith that came before us were running a race as well. And they were running for the same prize that we're running for. And that we should examine their lives and how they ran their races and use that to encourage us in our own races. Now today, I want to look at the example of someone in the Bible that ran a race. Actually, there are 3 characters in the story that we're going to read today that ran a race. The race of life. And the story we're going to read is Ruth. We're going to read the entire story today. But before we do that, I want to give you a little bit of background about the story of Ruth. The book of Ruth is set in the time period of the Judges. That was a time period after the Exodus, but before the Kings. And it was a time period most known for the statement, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, the book of Ruth is also one of the festival scrolls. It's traditionally read by observant Jews every Feast of Pentecost, which I think is interesting. It's a historical book, but I think we'll see a lot of symbolism in the story that foreshadowed things that God had planned for the future as well. So let's start with the book. Let's go back to Ruth. That's pretty much what we're going to do today. Joshua Judges Ruth. It's a small book. We'll start in verse 1. It says, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons, and the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Now, obviously, the story starts off talking about a man named Elimelech who left Israel during a famine. Now, he presumably would have been a wealthy man because he was a landowner, as we'll see later on. And he left with his entire family, which consisted of his wife and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they head to Moab. Now, that in itself is a bit unusual. Moab was descended from Lot, so it was not considered a Canaanite people, but the Moabites and the Israelites didn't get along very well back then. As Israel came into the land, through the Exodus, the king of Moab had actually hired Balaam to curse Israel when they went to the promised land. And he had tried to entice them with women, Midianite women. And Moab worshipped a pantheon of gods, but they had a main god that they called Chemosh. Now, we don't really know a whole lot about the worship of Chemosh. I tried to look that up, and they just didn't have a lot in there about him. But they did say that there was some evidence that human sacrifice was involved in his worship. Now, as this occurred in the time period of the Judges, again, every man did what was right in their own eyes. And it's likely that the famine would have been considered a punishment from God, because when they did things that were right in their own eyes, it frequently was not right in God's eyes. Now, the two sons take Moabite wives, but then they die. Now, if we consider things from Naomi's point of view, her early life was probably very positive. You know, in a race, when you start off, at least whenever I started off, I always had lots of energy. And that first burst, when the gun went off, you'd start off on a runner's high. And I kind of feel like Naomi probably had that here. She got married to somebody who was upstanding in the community, a landholder. She had two sons. The very early part of her life would have been very good. But then they moved to Moab, and things progressively went downhill from there. You know, the death of her husband, that would have been a huge blow, but at least she would have had her two sons to take care of her after that. But then the death of both sons, and it sounds like the death of both sons occurred fairly quickly, at about the same time. It would have been a huge emotional low. It would have been really, really hard for her to go on at that point, because in the thinking of the day, that family was basically considered dead. There were no heirs to carry on the name anymore. Now, I know when I ran races, especially that first year, about the middle of the race, you would hit something that was called the runner's wall. And basically, that was a point where you just wanted to stop. And when I first started running, that's what I did. I stopped and started walking. And Juan quickly informed me that that was not what you should do. That you needed to just push through it, and that if you pushed through it, you'd get a second wind, and you could continue on. So I tried it, and sure enough, it shocked me the first time I did it, but I kept going, and I thought I was going to die or pass out. But I pushed through it, and I had a little bit of extra energy. Now, I feel like in life, sometimes when horrible things happen, we can get depressed. And that's almost like a spiritual runner's wall. It can make us feel like we can't go on, maybe even just in our regular lives. But it's something that happens in a race as well. Let's continue on. Verse 6. Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husband? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So after the sons died, Naomi hears that God's blessed Israel. That happened a lot in the Judges. God would bless them and bring a new judge, and things would be better. So she decides she wants to head home. And she does not want the daughter-in-laws to go home with her. She loves them. It's very obvious that she loves the daughter-in-laws, and she wants what's best for them. And she believes that what is best for them is that they go back to their own families, and they get their own husbands, and they live normal lives. Now, she blessed them by wishing that God would show the kindness to them that they had shown to her and her sons. And I think this is similar to what Jim was talking about. That kindness word here is chesed, and it means a loving kindness. And it definitely involved that they were going above and beyond what they had to do. And they had done so for her sons while they were alive. And she also addressed the concept of the Levirate marriage. Now, what that involves, there is in the scripture a way that you could raise up for a dead person an heir. But because Elimelech and both of his sons died without children, the name of the household of Elimelech would die. However, if a close relative, now in the Bible it states it's a brother, would take the widow bride and have a child with her, that child would be raised up in the dead man's name and would get his inheritance. However, Naomi points out that this was a really unrealistic expectation for the two daughters-in-law. We don't know how old Naomi is. I know that Jewish tradition teaches that she was 60. I think she was probably much younger than that. I suspect she was probably around 40. But we don't know for sure. But the point is, even if she had a husband at that point, it would have been at least 14 to 20 years before the child would have been old enough to try and have a child of their own. And that was unrealistic for the daughter-in-laws to basically give up that period of time. And Orpah did the expected thing then. She returned to her family. But it says that Ruth does not. It says that Ruth clung to Naomi. And apparently she had established such a bond with Naomi that she would not leave her. If we continue on in verse 16, it says, "But Ruth said, 'Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.' And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her." So Naomi basically stops trying to dissuade her anymore because Ruth makes a commitment to abandon her old life totally. She basically is putting her old life to death and committing to a new life with a new land, a new people, and a new God. And she's committing to that God when she states this. She's basically putting everything about her life behind her and moving forward. And I think that's an analogy of what we are supposed to do at baptism as well. We're supposed to put our old person to death and become a new person. So we can relate to that a little bit, but probably not in the same way that Ruth did. Now, if we read on in verse 19, it says, "Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?' So she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So they returned to Bethlehem, and they received a warm welcome back. Both of them did. But you can see that Naomi's spirit is still very, very low. Her name, Naomi, actually means pleasant. But she tells everyone, "Don't call me pleasant." She says, "Call me Mara." Mara means bitter, because that's how she viewed her life. Their return is at the beginning of the barley harvest, so it would have been right around the Passover that they returned. So it's in the spring of the year. Now, if we start chapter 2, it says, "And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, 'Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered him, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, 'It is the young Moabite woman, who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab.' And she said, 'Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves.' So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house." Now we're introduced to the last of the main characters here, and that is Boaz. Now Boaz was a kinsman of Naomi's husband, probably a cousin, and he is wealthy and prominent, but he's also much older. And God works it out that Ruth happens to wander into his field. She doesn't go there intentionally. She just happens to find her way into his field as she's gleaning. Now, gleaning was a means for very poor people to actually be able to stay alive back at that time. And technically, Ruth would not have needed to ask to glean because God had indicated that it was the right of the poor to do that, but she had shown deference in asking. And what gleaning really meant was that you would go in to a field after the harvesters had gone in, and you would pick up any of the scraps that they had left behind. Now, they were supposed to intentionally leave some things behind. They were supposed to leave the corners of their fields behind, and they were supposed to have, be generous to the poor by leaving some things behind. Now, Boaz, a lot of the commentaries I read speculated that Boaz might have previously been married, but the scripture doesn't say anything with regard to that. So we don't know a whole lot about Boaz's life prior to this, but we know that at this point, life seems to be pretty good for Boaz. He seems to be, have a lot of servants. He seems to have property. But what the Bible doesn't talk about is it never talks about a wife, and it never talks about him having children. From the scripture, it appears that he's single, and he's always by himself, even when he's sleeping at night with the harvest. But the Bible doesn't specifically tell us those things. And finally, it's important to note that it appears that Boaz had another special thing that would have very much related to him. Now, we're not told this here, but we're told elsewhere that Boaz's mother was actually Rahab. Now, Rahab was not an Israelite. If you remember the story of the Israelites' conquest of Jericho, Rahab was the innkeeper or prostitute that basically hid the spies and was delivered from Jericho. And then she obviously married a man from Judah and had a son named Boaz. This is the same Boaz. So his mother was also not an Israelite. I think that's important probably to the story. And I'd also point out that Boaz and his servant were very impressed with Ruth's work ethic. They noticed her right off the bat. If we continue, in verse 8 it says, Then Boaz said to Ruth, You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, It has been fully reported to me, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, Come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied, and kept some back. And when she arose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also, let some grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Boaz definitely notices Ruth, and he's impressed with her. He tells her not to leave his fields, and then he goes out of his way to show her kindness. Kindness is a very important concept, not only to God, but to us human beings. As Jim was speaking, God notices kindness. It's a fruit of his spirit. I think it's also important to notice that Ruth takes notice of the kindness that Boaz is showing her. As a young guy, if you're trying to impress a girl, showing kindness is not a bad way to do it. And also notice Boaz had done his homework even before he met Ruth, because he knew all about her and how she had treated Naomi and how she had come to the God of Israel for refuge. Boaz even tells his servants to make sure there was a little extra for Ruth to glean. And I imagine at this point, both Ruth and Boaz are kind of experiencing one of those emotional highs as something new and exciting has entered their lives. Perhaps they didn't look at each other romantically at this point, but they definitely both noticed each other. It's sort of, when those positive things come into your life, it's sort of like in a race when you hit a hill and you're on the downward side. Things come so much easier, when you're using gravity with you as opposed to going against you. If we continue on in verse 17, it says, So she gleaned in the field until evening and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah of barley is about a bushel of barley. It's a lot of barley, probably much more than somebody would have been expected to glean in a single day. Then she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, Where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Blessed be it of the Lord. Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said to her, The man is a relative of ours, one of our near kinsmen. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also said to me, 'You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field.' So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law." I kind of picture when Ruth comes home from working that first day and she brings that bushel of barley with her. I don't know how she carried it, but she brought it home. It was a lot more than Naomi anticipated. Naomi immediately recognizes that somebody has noticed Ruth. Now, Naomi looks at Ruth as a daughter. When a mother notices that somebody has noticed their daughter, they notice that. And it really shows the care that Ruth had for Naomi also, that, the first thing she does when she comes home is she brings out the part of the lunch that she had saved, the parched grain and whatnot, and she gives it right away to Naomi. She'd stocked it away, thinking that as soon as I get home, hey, I'll give this to Naomi. Naomi correctly assumes that somebody had noticed Ruth. And Naomi is impressed by the kindness that Boaz is showing to both her and Ruth. She recognizes the kindness is also being shown to her as well. Now it states that she works gleaning from the barley harvest to the wheat harvest. The wheat harvest would have been around Pentecost. So it would have been for about 2 months that she would have been gleaning every day in his fields. Naomi would have been excited about this. She recognizes that this could be something that she hadn't anticipated as a kindness not only to her, but to possibly bring back the name of her husband's family. She recognizes that when she says, hey, this is a near kinsman. That's what she's recognizing there. So if we start chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?' Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our kinsman? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you should do.' And she said to her, 'All that you say to me, I will do.'" Now, Naomi's plan to seek security for Ruth involves some matchmaking. She's going to play the matchmaker. And it's interesting that the 3 things that she instructs Ruth to do in preparation, she tells her, make sure to wash yourself, anoint yourself with oil, and put on your very best clothes. She was also supposed to do that at night after Boaz had eaten and drunk and fall asleep. She's supposed to be in tip-top condition for Boaz. So in verse 6, it tells us, "So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did according to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled, and turned himself, and there was a woman lying at his feet. And he said, 'Who are you?' So she answered, 'I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a near kinsman.' Then he said, 'Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Now Ruth does exactly what she was supposed to do, according to Naomi. And to say that Boaz was surprised is probably an understatement. You know, Ruth is proposing marriage to Boaz here. It's not the other way around. Ruth is proposing marriage under the terms of a Levirate marriage, which would involve fathering and raising up a child in someone else's name, Elimelech's name in this particular instance. She's asking him to be a kinsman redeemer, and she's linking marriage to her as part of the price of redemption. Now, not too long ago, Jerry had given a sermon on what it meant to be a kinsman redeemer. Perhaps you don't remember those details, but the short form of this was it required three things. First, the person had to be a kinsman. Second, the person had to have the financial means to redeem. And finally, the person had to be willing to redeem. And I'd also point out that in Jerry's sermon, he also pointed out that the kinsman redeemer was also a very good symbol for what Jesus did for us, for the church. Now also, we don't know how old Boaz is. I believe Jewish tradition says that he was 80. I don't think he was probably that old, but it could have been. But we have a decent idea that there was a large age difference here. Jewish tradition teaches that Ruth was 40. However, other things in the scripture here would lead me to believe that she was probably a lot younger than that. Most girls at that time period would have married around age 14. And no, Lily, that shouldn't give you any ideas. But Ruth had been married in Moab for 10 years. So she was probably in her mid-20s at this point. And by Boaz indicating that she had shown greater kindness in not going after the young guys, both poor or rich, she must have been quite attractive. Because Boaz is implying that the young rich guys could have been had if she had gone after them. Or the young poor guys, He basically saying you could have had the good looking and the wealth if that's what you were after. However, they would not have provided the heir for Naomi that Ruth was seeking. So if we read on in verse 12, it says, Boaz is speaking back to her, and he says, "Now it is true that I am a near kinsman. However, there is a kinsman nearer than I. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a near kinsman for you, good. Let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one could recognize another. Then he said to her, "Do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Also he said, "Bring the shawl that is on you and hold it." And when he held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So when she came to her mother-in-law, I'll stop there. So there's a problem. Boaz is not the closest relative. However, he says that he will perform the duty for her. He says, if the other guy's willing to do it, good. Based off of some of the other things that happen in the story, I don't think he really means that. But he gives her 6 measures of barley. Now, a lot of the commentaries I read said that this was a way of him indicating that he would handle the matter as quickly as possible, because the number of 6 was representative of a Friday, and he would get everything done before the Sabbath. So if we go to verse 16, it says, "So when Ruth, came to her mother-in-law, she said, 'Is that you, my daughter?' Then she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, 'These 6 ephahs of barley he gave me. For he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law.' Then she said, 'Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day.'" I laugh when I read this part. Naomi wanted all the details of what happened that night and wanted to know how her plan had worked out. Just this past week when Rachel went out to pick the kids up from camp, she just couldn't wait to get in the car and hear how camp had gone for Lily and if she liked somebody or what all the details of what had gone on had just gone on. I imagine that with the daughter. Naomi's doing the exact same thing here with Ruth. She wants to hear every tiny little detail, especially all the juicy details. Some things always stay the same. Now, if we read chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the near kinsman of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, 'Come aside, friend, sit down here.' So he came aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit down here.' So they sat down. Then he said to the near kinsman, 'Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you.' And he said, 'I will redeem it.'" Now Boaz seems very motivated here. The description of Boaz dropping everything to address this implies to me that he was anxious for this. This wasn't some duty that he was dreading. It's first thing in the morning. He's got 10 guys lined up already, just waiting for this guy to come into town. And he sets things up a little bit differently. The first thing he says is, "Are you willing to redeem the property?" Now that would have been what's expected here. And he's sort of setting it up because maybe the guy doesn't even want to do that, because redeeming the property is going to cost money. But the near kinsman says that he's willing to redeem it. So then Boaz goes to the next step. If we read in verse 5, he says, "Then Boaz said, 'On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead on his inheritance.' And the near kinsman said, 'I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem it, my right of redemption for yourself. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it.'" Now, I'd like to point out that in the biblical description that we're given for a kinsman redeemer, it involved property or freedom. But it was never linked to the Levirate marriage anywhere else in the Bible. A Levirate marriage was something separate, and it was normally performed by the brother, not just a close relative. Although it's easy to see that if no brother existed, that they might, go to a close relative to perform that duty. But regardless, Ruth initially linked the two, and Boaz is linking the two, the redemption of the property with the marriage to Ruth. And the closer relative doesn't seem to object to this linkage. Perhaps that was customary. Perhaps they didn't know their Bible that well and just sort of made things up. Or perhaps, it was like that and we just don't have it recorded. However, the close relative is now no longer willing to perform the role of kinsman redeemer once it's established that the redemption comes with the marriage to Ruth. It isn't exactly clear what the issue was that could have jeopardized his estate, but it's likely that he had children from his own marriage, and that a marriage with Ruth producing another child would complicate the inheritance picture. That's what most of the commentaries seem to think. So, because it was going to mess with the inheritance of his own children, he didn't want to touch it. Plus, he already had a wife. Perhaps she wasn't too keen on the idea of a new wife, especially if this wife was really attractive. So if we can move on to verse 7, it says, Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was an attestation in Israel. Therefore the near kinsman said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," so he took off his sandal. So the near relative and Boaz sealed the deal by giving the sandal in the presence of 10 witnesses, which were the elders that he had collected before. Boaz had now crossed all of his T's. He's dotted his I's. He's got everything set in place. So in verse 9 he says, "And Boaz said to the elders and to all the people, 'You are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife, to raise up the name of the dead on his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his place. You are witnesses this day.'" So Boaz formalizes everything. He formalizes the marriage. He formalizes the purchase of the redemption of the property. It had already been sold. It's being redeemed. He formalizes it all. He had everything all set up with the elders. It's all good to go. "And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman.'" All of the witnesses extend their blessings. In the analogy of a race, we're in sight of the finish line now. I remember many a race where I'd get near the finish line. People would be lining up close to it. People normally were, for me, people who had already finished the race and were coming back to sort of cheer on the leggers on. And they'd be cheering you on, and you'd get a burst of energy that you didn't know you had. You thought you'd given it all up, but when there were people there and they're watching you and they're motivating you, all of a sudden you had a little bit extra. And that's where we're headed here with the lives of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. So in verse 13 it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a near kinsman. And may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons has bore him.' Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, 'There is a son born to Naomi.' And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron, Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Abinadab, Abinadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David." The story ends on that high note. They finished the race. Boaz and Ruth have a son. By Naomi taking the son and laying him on her bosom, she was claiming the son for herself. This son would restore the name of her husband, the name of her son. He would also be her security in life, as he would provide for her when she could no longer take care of herself. It's also interesting to note that Ruth, a foreigner and a widow, was now the grandmother to a king, King David, and also an ancestor to Jesus Christ. The story ends there with the wedding and the birth of the Son of Redemption. I couldn't help but think that this is sort of reminiscent of our hope as well. We have a hope. Let's turn back to Revelation chapter 19. We have a hope as God's people. It's his church. Revelation chapter 19, we're going to read verses 7 through 9. Revelation chapter 19, starting in verse 7, it says, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true sayings of God." You know, the end of the story of Ruth is similar to the end of the story as far as we know it in the Bible. You know, we don't really know what happens after the marriage supper, the spiritual marriage supper that goes on. We know that there's a new Jerusalem, but the details beyond that are very sketchy. We don't really know that. You know, for now, that's our spiritual finish line, to make it to that marriage supper. It's interesting that Jesus, he's the Redeemer of all the earth, and that we as the church are a spiritual Israel made up of people that God calls, including foreigners. I really do believe that the story of Ruth foreshadows so much of what God had planned to do. So, brethren, we too are running our race of life. You know, we're going to have ups, we're going to have downs. Sometimes those downs are going to be so low that we really think we can't go on. But we need to push through those. We need to keep our eyes fixed on the finish line, because we all have that same spiritual finish line that we're working towards, the marriage of the Lamb and the bride. So let us run and finish the race that God has set before us.